Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I am here with Tim Enloe. We were just commiserating over the fact that it's Monday morning and the coffee supply may be short, but we're here to give it our all. I'm here, as I said, with Mr. Tim Enloe. Hi, Tim. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about, you're offering 7 courses at Kepler this coming fall. All of them are year-long courses. And as I was looking so there are 3 language courses, which we'll want to talk about at a certain point, but viewers can see on the bottom all the courses that Mr. Enloe is offering. And you'll see that there's Christ in the Greeks, Christ in the Romans, and Christ in the Middle Ages. So we're going to talk today about Jesus Christ. How about that? Is that a broad enough topic?
Yeah. What's to say? Everything.
Right.
It's
right.
everything.
Exactly right. Yes. Well, the idea really is for what we want to talk about. So, his courses, of course, will go very in depth and examine, through the lens of the humanities, through history, examine a lot of a whole lot, and you can read the course description. We are going to focus a little more on what happens when Christ the King confronts humanity, when Jesus Christ confronts humanity. And I chose the word confronts, so I'm not sure how Mr. Enloe might interact even with that. Let's just talk about that. When Jesus Christ confronts humanity, how about the word confronts? Is that a fair word?
Yeah, that it might not have been the first word I chose because my focus is based on God's providence, how God has used different cultures, even unbelieving cultures, to prepare the way for the gospel. However, the word confront is not bad in the sense that it is a confrontation with idolatries and the basic Christian demand for that people repent and come to Christ. So it's not a bad word. It just wouldn't necessarily be the first one that I chose.
Well, and there are different contexts. When we're talking about Christ and the Greeks, that's one conversation. I imagine it would definitely be weighted more towards the paving the way sort of thing. When talking about Christ in the Middle Ages, it's a whole other world at that point.
Yes. Because in the Middle Ages, at least, you have for all intents and purposes, a fully Christian culture it still has a lot of baggage left over from the Greeks and the Romans, and not all of those things were good, but it was a culture that was fully committed to working out the gospel, however that looked, in different countries and different centuries and so forth. And like anything else, it wasn't always consistent. But yes, you're right, it would look different for the Middle Ages than for Greece or Rome.
So, as we discussed before the talk, what I'd like to do is go through and use as titles for our sections: Christ in the Greeks, Christ in the Romans, Christ in the Middle Ages. And then, if you feel qualified to comment, I'd love to talk about the subsequent ages as well, a little more briefly.
Okay.
So let's talk Christ and the Greeks. And we can start with your class as a sort of way to open up the theme. I believe you said pave the way was your phrasing?
Prepare the way. Yeah.
Prepare the way. Yeah. So I'd love for you to just talk about Christ and the Greeks.
Okay. Well, I get the idea of preparing the way actually from some of the church fathers. I believe it's Eusebius in particular who notes that Greek culture prepared the way, was the preparatio evangelii, to use the Latin terms, the preparation for the gospel. That could be taken in a super positive direction where we don't actually critique the errors of the Greek culture, and I don't intend for that to be the case. There's going to be plenty of critique where it is warranted, because yes, Greek culture was idolatrous. They really did worship false gods, and that is bad. And so I don't tend to downplay that at all in the course. But what I want to do with all of these courses is reorient more towards a positive direction. Yes, there were errors, but God is bigger than those. How did he use all of that? Even the stuff that is erroneous. He used even the stuff that was erroneous to push the world towards where Jesus could come in and the gospel could be spread to the whole world. So
there's so many areas. I'm sorry.
I'm just saying it's more of a positive orientation, not downplaying the negative, but more towards how can we see God's providence moving through these things?
Right, but there must be some some special connection that you see, because there are a lot of histories and a lot of philosophies, which we could say the same thing. Sure, it's erroneous, but there's great benefit to be gotten from studying it. But you're not teaching Taoism,
Right.
right? I mean, so you're teaching the Greeks for a reason.
Right.
There must be some sort of special relationship you see.
Sure. Well, for me, I tend to focus the Greeks through the example of Socrates, which, if one isn't careful, that could become anachronistic, reading Socrates way back into 1,000 years before him and something that would not be appropriate historical methodology. But to me, Socrates is the paradigm of what God did with the Greeks. It took a long time to get them to that point, but once they were there, Socrates got them thinking about, why do we worship these gods? What is so great about Zeus after all? Zeus is an adulterer. He often arbitrarily dispenses punishment for reasons known only to himself. These other gods and goddesses, they are really, really bad moral examples. This is one of the reasons Socrates gets himself killed, because they don't like this kind of thing. The Greeks do not really want to go in this direction, but something happened with Socrates. I'm not going to say he was a prophet. I'm not going to say he was divinely inspired. That's confined to the writers of the scripture. But God did something with Socrates and made these Greeks start going, what are we doing? Why is the world broken? Why are we like this? Why do we fight and tear each other up all the time? And that's only just 400 years before Christ came, when Socrates is doing this.
No, I know a lot of writers from the earlier eras of the church interacted a lot with that thought. Could you talk a bit about that? With the thought that not just with the thought that Socrates was special, but that the Greeks were on to something fundamental.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's a number of different areas that could be focused on. I think probably one of the most important ones is, if you think about the way the Gospel of John opens, in the beginning was the Word, in Greek, hologos, the Word, right? That's a very expansive Greek word. It means things like word, reason, account, reckoning, plan. So John, many Christians, early Christians especially, argued that the Gospel of John even is hearkening back to this old philosophical concept of the Word, which many Greek philosophers had. They looked at the world of experience, the sun, the moon, the stars, the way the weather worked. They didn't figure out what we would call scientific explanations for these things, but they looked at these things, many of them, and said, there has to be a mind behind this. It just doesn't make sense to say all of this is random chance. That's not actually an explanation. These are pagan philosophers who know better than modern evolutionists. They're going, chance doesn't actually mean anything. We aren't explaining anything. There must be a mind behind this. Now, qualify. Did they identify that mind with the God of the Bible? No, of course not. And that's where the critique would come in. But they were on to something with, there is a mind, a divine mind behind these things. There's a plan and a purpose and a reason for everything that happens. And I think that dovetails with the scriptural theme of God's providence, God's overarching sovereignty over the world. Again, not that they were talking about anything that they would recognize as the God of the Bible, but they were heading towards that. As Acts 17 says, they were groping about in the hopes of finding something, and they found something, not the gospel, but they found the problem. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah. Yes, they found the problem, and I think that the Greeks are probably the greatest example of the human achievement of finding the problem.
Yeah.
And other civilizations also sort of groped in the darkness as well.
You read the tragedies, and they feel what we call the brokenness of the fall. They don't call it that. They don't ever attribute it to our first parents sinning against God in the garden. But they do have some interesting little myths about brokenness at the beginning of the world.
Yes.
It's not quite what we say, and they don't attribute it to that. But they feel, the tragedians especially, feel the brokenness of the fall, and they just don't know what to do about it.
And then as we study the tragedies, we feel that they feel it.
Yes, and that's a prime benefit for us as Christians. We can say these people were just like us. They feel the brokenness of the world. And like Paul on the Areopagus in Acts 17, we have the solution. Look,
Yes.
here is the God that you've been looking for.
Well, I think that's a really important notion for young Christian students, because so often they're brought up in Christian households and they know in their head what the problem is, but perhaps they don't feel it, right? And being exposed to humanity's quest, to humanity's grappling with the problem, to humanity's looking for answers, I think it's an important part of that education is being exposed to that despair.
Yeah. You can, any number of examples could be brought up. I almost always think of the Iliad when Hector comes in and meets with his wife Andromache, and his little baby son is afraid of him because he's got all his war gear on. Anyway, if you know what I'm talking about, if you've read the Iliad, it's one of those poignant scenes in all of literature. And you have this character, this good character. To the extent that you can argue Hector is good, he feels the conflict between I must uphold my honor and defend my city so that my family will survive. But if I go out there and fight, I'm probably going to die. And probably my wife and my child are going to be taken away in slavery because, hey, the gods, he has this fatalism about him. But you really read that and let it get in there. Even as a Christian, you feel with them the brokenness that has caused this to happen. And they just don't have the answer. Right.
And I think fatalism is actually an important aspect of that. Because even, leaving the Greeks, going into, Norse paganism, most forms, well, certainly more Stoic forms of paganism, they have this fatalism, which is admirable. You admire the courage of the man who decides to resist all of it, the gods, the ocean, everything coming at him. And yet, I think it ends up being striking if you let yourself into that world, that imaginative world. It ends up being quite striking that there's no escape, and the achievements are so small.
Yes,
it's noble, but so mean in the end. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on the notion that Plato was influenced by Moses?
Oh goodness!
Just bringing back an old classic.
Yeah, no, I've not really studied that out in depth. Who was it that said that? Was that Augustine? I think
it was. Yes,
in the City of God. It's fascinating. I haven't really looked at it in any detail. It's possible because certainly the Jewish books were circulating at the time in the late 300s. The 400s, when Socrates and Plato were around. It is possible that they had those books. I don't know that it's likely.
Right. Yeah, possible, certainly.
It's certainly very interesting to think of because I think it is Augustine also that says if you just changed a few words and phrases, Plato would have been a Christian. So, I'm not going to say I agree with him on that, but, hey, it is Augustine. You got to be careful when you disagree with Augustine. You better make sure you have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. Yep. If you're going to disagree with that.
Also the ducks in a row. Yeah.
Ducks in a row and all of that. It's a very interesting notion.
Yeah, it is. It's certainly thought-provoking. It makes you think a little more, even if you end up thinking it's unlikely, which I do as well. But it makes you think a little more of the context of the ancient world, which is always helpful. But thanks, everybody who's tuning in right now. We appreciate you. And you are very welcome to not only comment, but question and quiz. Feel very free to drop some feedback and some questions for us.
Put me on the spot.
Yes, exactly right. Now, before we move to Christ and the Romans, I wonder if you could sort of, in a soundbitey fashion, so something concise, tell us how the Greek, and we've talked about this, right? So what we're trying to do here is just have something very concise that we can take away with us. How did the Greeks pave the way for Christ?
Okay, soundbitey. I would say that they looked at the world of human experience and came to think that there's a divine mind behind it. And then they spent the rest of their time before Christ came trying to find out what that mind was.
And groping in the darkness.
Groping in the dark.
Yes. Okay.
In the dark.
It's interesting as I look at your teaching philosophy here on our Kepler website. So, guys, as you're watching this video, you can scroll down in the description and click on his link, to see his teacher profile, Mr. Enloe's teacher profile, and his courses. This is in the teaching philosophy. I practice a classical model that transcends its pagan roots and is transformed by submission to Christ, in whom are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge and godliness. By using the classical liberal arts, which plumb the depths of created reality, we use nature to show our fellow men that nature, while pronounced good by God, is, because of its fallen condition, not enough. So a couple of interesting aspects there. You've covered. I think that last part, we talk about. You talked about the Greeks, right? That it's not enough, but it's beneficial to study. But the first thing I read there, a classical motto which transcends its pagan roots and is transformed by submission to Christ, might be an interesting lens through which to look at Christ and the Romans. Mm-hmm. So, the Romans actually, Jesus has come and transformation begins. So let's talk about Christ and the Romans.
Okay. So what I want to do with Christ and the Romans, I mean, it's the same basic idea, is to try to read these old pagan books and try to find ways that God was working in the background and using even the erroneous things to move the world in the way that he wants it to go. What's that phrase? God draws straight with crooked pens, or something like that. I think I always mess that up, but it's something like that. God can make straight lines with things that are broken, with writing instruments that are broken. And that's the mystery of providence. We look back at history and we don't always see what was going on there. So anyway, with Christ and the Romans, the focus would shift to how the Romans took up the Greek heritage, all the things that we were just talking about, modified it, because that's what the Romans were good at. They would take some of everything and smash it all together through distinctly Roman lenses. They took what they liked and left what they didn't like and oriented it in a different direction. And what the Romans were about, as I read them, is law, order, good government, bringing the Greeks are often said that they were theoretical. They were more like the abstract Plato, the forms, and all of this. The Romans sort of wanted that idea, but they wanted it practical. What does this look like on the ground in the laws that we make and the systems of government that we make? And so it's from Rome, especially, if anyone knows anything about American history, which most of us do, the founding fathers were very, very big on the Greek and the Roman classics. And the Romans especially, they really were fascinated by how the Romans took up different threads of how do you make a government. You can do this, you can do this, you can do this. Well, they wanted to kind of bring it all together into a coherent whole that would be stable. And they did create a lot of stability. And as far as one way that I see Christ working with them, especially, you think about the Roman peace, the Pax Romana that Augustus established. That pacified the entire Mediterranean world. It was very violent getting there. The pacification itself was very, very violent. But by the time it was done, the entire Mediterranean world was at peace. You could walk from one end of the empire to the other on these amazing roads and never have to worry about getting waylaid by a robber or not making it to your destination. Everybody spoke the same language. What is that going to do for the spread of the gospel? It's going to enable the apostles and their followers to go all over the world, as they knew it at the time, to take the gospel to every nation. So those are just a couple of hints about what I see with Christ and the Romans. There's more, but
well, yeah, I'm sure a year's worth of more. In fact,
yeah, definitely. And even then, you get to the year and you're like, "What? It's over? There's got to be more." Well, you go find it then.
So I want to ask you an oversimplified and unfair question. I won't put any pressure on you, but it's one of those things that I've heard often, at least, and it is and even the people who say it, of course, it's an oversimplification. But what do you think of the idea of the presentation of Greek culture, the Greeks as a culture of philosophers, and the Romans as a culture, a society of engineers? And then so interacting with that idea, and true or not, how does that affect the Roman legacy for us?
As a as a caricature, which you've acknowledged that it is, I think it does work. I've seen scholars, professional scholars, use that as just a general heuristic or a model, so to speak, to get, because Greece and Rome is like huge. You need to get a focal point, and any kind of focal point that a person generates is going to leave out things here and there. It's just the nature of the game, and you got to try to pick a good focal point that doesn't leave out too much. But just as a general idea, I think that works for trying to get a handle on the Greeks and the Romans. And then you said, I think, how does that work out for the Roman legacy?
Right, to us.
Yeah. Well, I think that you can see that again, to go back to even just America and the founding fathers. A great deal of our governmental structure is pulled straight out of the Romans. The Greek philosophy is in the background, but the practical day-to-day matters of how our own American government is formed and how it's supposed to work is lifted off the Roman Republic. It's what's called the mixed constitution, where you have three different kinds of sources for government. You have what they call the one, one guy in charge. You have the few, which would be like an aristocracy. Then you have the many, which would be democracy. Three basic elements. The Romans tried to take those three and combine them into one kind of government, so that the strengths of all three would be there, balancing out the weaknesses of all three. Now, we tend to call that in American history separation of powers, things of that nature. We have our own little phrases for it, but that was straight out of the Romans' experience of founding a republic, and how their republic engaged with other governments around, how it fared, how it was corrupted, how it was turned into an empire. So very, very much engineering, I guess, practical day-to-day law and order stuff. Mm-hmm. That's the Romans' legacy to us.
Yeah, it's important when a society has this change of expectation, right? Where there's an idea that justice could exist, right? I mean, just that notion is enough to transform expectations. But so those who are viewing know that these are unscripted conversations. So I'd actually like to ask you a question that I'm curious about, but it's quite possible that you've never given much thought to it. So You're very welcome to wiggle out of it. Some folks make much of a difference between the Roman, even acknowledging that there's been great influence, but the Roman legacy as far as law and order go, and the Germanic tradition of common law, which also said to have influenced American law and British law. So what do you have any thoughts about how the Roman legacy interacts with Magna Carta, and then the English tradition with Parliament, and that sort of representation? Any thoughts?
I have general thoughts that I think would also be developed in time, looking at specific texts. But and actually, that I don't know if you're ready to segue into Christ in the Middle Ages. But that's perfect, isn't it? I was unplanned, but wonderful. Okay, because bringing up the Germanic influence is getting us into the Middle Ages, because when you go through Roman history, you see what happened is the Roman Empire starts to fall in the middle of the 4th century. The fall takes like 100+ years or something, and fall is a relative term. It's just in the West. Just in the West, it falls apart. It remains in the East for 1,000 years after that, which is another interesting story we can't get into. But
I was curious to know if 1453 was one of your classes.
Unfortunately, in the scope of only a year, we can only deal with the West. So we won't be dealing with the Byzantine Empire, except insofar as it comes into contact with the West. So one has to draw a line somewhere.
Yes. As you said, you have to choose your focal point.
Roman Empire, two very different stories. Anyway, so when you get into the Germanic tribes, yes, that causes the Roman heritage itself to mutate, as it were. I don't know if that's a good word or not, but the Germanic tribes are the ones that conquer the Roman Empire in the West, and they have their own notions of government, their own notions of society, and that all starts just getting horribly, terribly train wreck mixed up in the fall of government in the West, and it produces fantastically new ideas about what society should look like. And by that time, everybody in the West is Christian in one form or another. There's some large pockets of Arianism that stick around for a while, but eventually everybody in the West is Catholic, not Roman Catholic necessarily, but Catholic. And the Germanic heritage causes a great deal of ferment in the ideas they got from the Romans. And the Christians take that and run with it and create all sorts of new and interesting experiments in government. It's an incredibly fascinating story.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting for us to, like, we as English speakers, Anglo-Saxons, right? There's a clear connection, a Germanic tracing back for us. But I mean, like the Spanish kingdoms were Gothic kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
North Africa had Germanic kingdoms. So there was, Italy had Germanic kingdoms through the various centuries of the Middle Ages. So it's when we talk about the mixture of Germanic traditions with Roman ones, we're talking about Western Europe and beyond.
Yeah, and speaking very generally on the level of generalisms, because it's an unscripted conversation. I don't have all my books out in front of me. So understand it is a generality, but one thing that the Germanic influence does, it is, as I read it, to the Roman heritage, is the Roman heritage as they received it had become empire based, had shifted back to rule by the one who is directly descended from the gods, so to speak. That it was kind of an autocracy when Rome fell. The Germanic influence always had this idea that the ruler is accountable to the people. And if he stops being a good ruler, stops taking care of the people, he's not a ruler anymore. And you don't actually have to obey him. So that's a really fascinating element that comes into how the Christians are taking the heritage of Rome. It sort of shifts the conversation back in the direction of republicanism, quote.
Yeah.
And causes medieval political philosophy to be incredibly interested in who is in charge and what are the limits of their power. And so in the Middle Ages, you have these huge, hundreds of years long battles between multiple emperors and popes and kings. You brought up Magna Carta. That's Magna Carta is actually set in the middle of the reign of Pope Innocent III, who's the most powerful pope ever, who's pushing papal claims of sovereignty over every nation, especially England. That's another interesting story. But yeah, I'm sort of rambling here because it is unscripted, but this is what the Germanic influence does to the Roman influence, is it kind of shifts the conversation back towards, we better take account to what the people want. And it can't just be unaccountable rulers claiming divine authority.
So Wes Callahan comments that Russell Kirk has great answers to this question too. The contributions of the Germanic tradition in the Middle Ages in his The Roots of American Order. Is that a work you've ever interacted with?
It is not. And this is, people keep telling me I need to read Russell Kirk. Yeah, I know I need to read Russell Kirk, and I could get his books and put them on the stack, but we all have these stacks, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have not read much Russell Kirk, just a little bit. So I would actually like to read what Mr. Callahan.
So we can all add it to our reading.
Give me another book, and I got to tell my wife to buy another book.
Well, would it be fair to again we're always condensing, but would it be fair to say that Roman law was interested? So you mentioned you have the one, you have the few, you have the many. And there are priorities at different times and different but they're priorities. Would it be fair to say that the Roman emphasis was on balance of power, where the Germanic was on limitations of power? And you can tell me I'm off my rocker. I won't take it personally.
No, there's something to that. I mean, certainly in the Roman Republic, the emphasis was on balance of power, and one of the tragic things about watching the Roman Republic fall.
Right.
From the time of the Second Punic War forward, is the balance of power gets lost repeatedly over and over again. Powerful men start sucking up the armies to themselves, and the on paper it's still a republic, but you're sitting here from the distance of 2,000 years going, no, you're becoming an autocracy again. Stop.
It would be interesting to read Julius Caesar with you, like the play.
Well,
so
Caesar is such a fascinating character too. Plutarch calls him a doctor of the state, claiming that basically the state was radically disordered and diseased, and Caesar came in like a doctor and fixed it. And that's not the way we usually think about Caesar.
No. Well, you have a course about Plutarch that I'd like to visit soon, and I would like to talk a little bit more about the Middle Ages. Daniel asked a question that will take us a little bit back in our conversation. Did you happen to watch the debate between Mary Beard and Boris Johnson on which is greater, Greece or Rome?
I started watching that, and it was really quite interesting. And then life happened, like 6 kids around my house that are homeschooled and, teaching courses and things. And unfortunately, I never completed that debate, but it was shaping up to be pretty interesting as far as I had seen.
I admire you for not trying to fudge that. Because some, hey, I saw 10 minutes of that. I could probably get an answer out.
Here I am.
Sorry, Daniel.
I'm teaching for a homeschool outlet, and I am a homeschooling parent. So I've got 6 wonderful daughters running around and I teach them stuff too. So I don't always finish videos that I start watching.
Daniel, who is a Frenchman, has also started quoting Asterix at us. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. Yes. Oh man, some of my favorite childhood reading. If you guys haven't read Asterix, please pick up copies. It's a crucial part of any classical education.
It should be a classical book.
So speaking specifically about the course, Christ in the Middle Ages, this course description begins with these words: for more than 1,000 years, Christianity shaped and ruled the world that the Greeks and Romans had left behind. So, clearly there's a sequential thing happening here, and, design of all these courses. So the study of the Middle Ages from the vantage point of how God's providence moved in and through the fallible works of men and women can be very rewarding, far from being the Dark Ages. Mm-hmm. And then you go on. So you mentioned the chimeric effect that happened when, as the empire collapsed in the West, and suddenly notions of law begin, and then something good and interesting comes out of that. But I wonder if you could, so far from being the Dark Ages, well, were there Dark Ages at all?
This is one of the most fascinating questions that I have dealt with in my many years of reading and study myself. I, like most of us, probably, I was raised with the idea of the Dark Ages, mm-hmm. right? And the Dark Ages is just that vague sort of time, like between the Stone Age and today, what's the Dark Ages. When we know a little bit more about history, we tend to think of the Dark Ages as the Middle Ages. They're coextensive with each other. Well, fascinatingly, the idea of the Dark Ages came from the Renaissance scholars in the 14th century, who had rediscovered a great many classical Latin texts that had actually been lost since the time of the Roman Empire. They were a lot of them were buried away in monastery libraries that monks faithfully copied them, but they didn't read them and they didn't really study them. So they started recovering all this Cicero and other authors, and they were going, whoa, have you read this? This is the Latin is unbelievably complicated and beautiful. And this junk that we write that we call Latin, might as well be ridiculous, the ravings of barbarians. So they came up with this idea that what had happened between classical Rome and themselves was the Dark Ages. And they were part of the rebirth, the renaissance of the classical standards. Now, to a very large extent, that's true. But the idea of Dark Ages kind of stuck with people and has taken on mythic proportions in our own disordered educational system today. I'm not sorry for saying that, but much of our educational system is very disordered, which is why we're doing all this classical education stuff, right? We're trying to get the order back. Anyway, I'm probably going on longer than you meant me to with this, but there was actually a period that is worthy of being called the Dark Ages, and that was in the 10th century. And it's primarily focused on incredibly horrific corruptions that were happening in the papacy at the time. And the men in the 10th century actually called that the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age. The 10th century, if there's any time that needed to be called the Dark Ages, it'd be the 10th century. But by and large, the Middle Ages are not a period of darkness. They are a period of great cultural ferment, because what we were talking about earlier, the Germanic influences, the Greek influences, the Roman influences, the Christian influences, all mixing up together in the West and making these incredibly what I'm losing my words are not coming to me. Just this incredibly fruitful synthesis that's happening in all the disciplines. It really was not a dark period. That's just one horror that's come down to us, and like I said, taken on mythic proportions in our own minds.
Right. And, I think, one of the things that people trot out as a great achievement of the Middle Ages are universities. Right. Yeah. And so you use the word synthesis. So I think it's interesting to think about how, because, we look at the classical model of education. So I'm not going to say classical Christian. I'll just say classical right now. And, so we think of the Greeks and Romans and of the ideas that they brought into play in education, the ideas that they instituted. But I think that there was something special in how Christians thought about synthesizing everything, because they're, only Christians can really have a true idea of integration, right? That age-old difficulty of the one and the many, right? Only Christians can actually truly synthesize. So I believe that only Christians can make synthesis a true goal.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we're
the only ones that have the principle that integrates everything, Christ, the fullness of wisdom, the wisdom and knowledge of God. So
Wesley Callahan says, great interview, really enjoying it. So we can stop there. Let's not do the rest of the comment. Excellent questions and responses. Tim's discussion of the Dark Ages and High Middle Ages is outstanding, but I'm off to plant potatoes. Well, that's an endorsement.
Yes, it is very, very high praise. Thank you, sir.
And I hope we were able to thank him for that endorsement before he disappeared into the potato patch. So you have there's a comment here. Well, I read a bit from the Christ in the Middle Ages course description, and you say Christianity shaped and ruled the world that the Greeks and Romans had left behind. So I don't want to make this question too big. I want it to be in the context of what we're talking about. So Christianity shaped and ruled the world. What is Christianity in that context?
In that context, okay.
How are you using it here?
Okay, in that context, it would be the Christianity as defined and hammered out by the ecumenical councils and the church fathers between the time of the after the death of the last apostle up to about I'd at least go through the fifth ecumenical council. Sixth and seventh are often controversial amongst Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox. So the Christological orthodoxy of the ecumenical councils would be the definition of Christianity, or at least the baseline. There are other things involved in that as well. But
so when you use the word Christianity here, would you use Christendom differently?
No. Christendom would just be the outworking of that. Particularly if you really, one thing I'm not particularly a scholar of is the ecumenical councils, but I know enough about the implications of the Christology articulated there to say it had political implications. We don't often say the Nicene Creed and think about, say, Christ's kingship over the world in two modes, spiritual and civic. But that's how that idea was taken by the medieval political thinkers. Christ is the king of the world. What does that look like? Oh, look, we're living in the ruins of the Roman Empire that we're trying to reconstruct. There are two realms of authority, spiritual and civil. How is Christ king over the spiritual? How is he king over the civil? And what is the relationship between those two? That would be the Christendom angle, the broad over political overstructure, so to speak, what we would call Christian culture, I suppose.
Right, and including, I would suppose, political thought.
Political thought, yes. Well, and of course, if you follow Aristotle, politics is the master discipline that organizes everything else. Political thought would then include literary universities, art, architecture, all of that. So
I would like.
I don't have a class on it, but I probably should.
So speaking of classes, actually, I would like to, as we near the end of our stream, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your language classes. You have a Greek 1, you've called it, and then Latin 3 and 4. Maybe a little bit about your teaching philosophy and how you approach teaching these languages.
Okay. Yeah, the Latin 3 and 4 would be primarily typical grammar and translation courses. I would really like to see the day when we get to where we're all speaking Latin in classrooms. The instruction is conducted in Latin and the students understand that. And there are a lot of people I know that are actually doing that. I think at New St. Andrews in particular, where I was educated, I think they heavily emphasize spoken Latin. But my courses, at least Latin 3 and 4, are the typical grammar and translation based courses where we go through different classical sources. Like I believe Latin 3 is partly using Eutropius's abridgment of Roman history. So you get some history as well as learning the Latin. By the time you get to Latin 4, we're doing Cicero, Virgil. They're fairly typical upper level Latin courses as far as I have seen in what my teaching experience.
Cool. Yeah. And actually the viewers should know that Mr. Enloe is the only teacher so far, I believe, who is offering a Latin 4 course, an advanced Latin course. So if you're someone who wants to pursue studying Latin in any way in college, this is the guy for you. And in fact, Jonathan Roberts wants us to know ego cum discipulis meis Latine loquor.
Yeah, I really appreciate the work that guys like Jonathan are doing. I unfortunately was not trained to speak Latin. I'm working on it a little bit at a time, but I have off to you guys that are doing it in the classroom every day. Keep that up, please, please, please. We need that back very badly.
Well, I took Latin for a year in college. I believe this, that I can translate this. I recognize every root because I'm a Portuguese speaker. So my one great Latin achievement was the teacher telling me that I had a good accent. and that was it. But yeah, so we'll thank Mr. Roberts for his comment and move on. So, folks, if you'd like to ask any questions of Mr. Enloe about what he said of Christ through the ages, now would be a wonderful time, and we could maybe use as a closing topic. So you talked about the influence of Christ, of Christianity on the Middle Ages. But you also talked about how in the Renaissance, people sort of reframed their own past and, define, you read Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's right, isn't it? Well, you read that and it's extremely anti-Christ, I think. You may disagree with that. But, there's almost like an agenda. And, there's this desire to rewrite history. Maybe interact with that idea. And again, I'm happy for you to tell me I'm off my rocker. And I'd love to maybe hear how you see the effect of Christianity in the Middle Ages unfolding until our present day.
Okay. That was kind of a big question.
Ignore all the rambling and just answer at the end.
It's great. I mean, I've honestly never read all of Gibbon, just some of it. And I share the general perspective you mentioned, even though I haven't read the whole of the book. I think in the as we get into the period of early modernity, so to speak, there's still a whole lot of solid Christian influence. The Greeks and the Romans and the medievals are still very much stamped on people's minds in the educational system, particularly in Protestant lands, who took up that old humanism and ran with it and adapted Aristotle to Protestant political thought and Plato, and still speaking Latin in the classrooms, and it's some fantastic things going on in early modernity. But I think as we move farther into modernity, that all of that starts to become less important to people, particularly with the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, problems that had always plagued mankind, scarcity, for instance. I'm going to ramble a little bit here. Disease, all of this starts to look like we can get control of this with all these new sciences that are being invented. We can get control of the world. We can make the world our possession. One of the early modern thinkers, Descartes, is famous for saying that his geometrical method, which he's wanting to apply to every discipline, is going to make man the master and possessor of nature, which is something the classical authors and the medieval authors would have been No, we are not the masters and possessors of nature in that sense. At any rate, this is a big story. I don't offer a Christ in the Moderns course because I'm still working on that one. But I do think what happens as we move farther into the modern period is the classical heritage gets pushed into the background. It gets despised. Oh, that was a world of scarcity and idiotic political ideas. And, look at all this stuff we can do with our sciences. So again, that ties back into why organizations like Kepler are even around today. We're trying to remind people, get people back into, there's an older way of looking at the world, and it's actually more integrated. It's more holistic. It doesn't have to give up the science. Look, here I am talking to you over a technological gizmo, and we're talking about classical education. So we don't have to give up the good things that science has done, for instance, but we really do need to get back a more holistic, integrated understanding of what human life is.
Yes.
And I just, I'm not going to apologize for saying hands down, it's the Greeks, the Romans, and the medievals that teach us what that is. We don't know what it means to be human. We really don't. We become a lot of machines clanking around in our daily industrialized lives. So that's my little box there. But
loved it. There are a lot of teachers who brought up Lewis's phrase "men without chests," and,
yes.
And I think that there's definitely that is happening to us. And the idea. So at Kepler, we are really emphasizing. Compared to some other, I'll just say that we're emphasizing STEM, right? Which is the acronym to describe the sciences, particularly the hard sciences. But we believe that that's a part of classical education. The key aspect of classical education, as you mentioned, is being holistic, is integration, and so that means that all of creation, right, needs to be a part of that, and then this lens that you're mentioning is really the lens through which we approach it. Thanks for letting me get on my soapbox.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important conversation to have. One of the most, as far as technology goes in classical education, one of the most meaningful things I've ever read. Plutarch, I love Plutarch. In the life of Marcellus, he has this little aside talking about all the little inventions that Archimedes made to defend Syracuse from the assault of the Romans in Syracuse harbor. And he's talking about, Archimedes is this great geometrician. He's just always absorbed with abstract problems of geometry. But because the king says, hey, help us, the Romans are attacking. He goes, all right, fine. Take this thing over here and I'll make you this little catapult and we'll pick the ships up out of the water and all this. Anyway, so that's the backdrop. They're telling all these cool stories about what technology does to fight the Romans. And then Plutarch has this little throwaway remark. I'm not even going to claim it's historical. I think it's more like Platonic philosophy. But he throws out this remark that at some point in the past, the Greeks decided not to pursue technology in any form other than basic defense because they did not want a mechanical life. They did not want to live in a machine and have their whole life be governed by mechanical assumptions. I don't know what to do with that. It's been eating on me ever since I read it like 10, 12 years ago. But I think it ties into the classical education discussion that we're having here. Technology is not a bad thing. The STEM disciplines are not bad. We need to integrate those with what it means to be human. And I know my other Kepler colleagues are teaching the STEM courses, and that's great. So maybe people should look at those as well.
Yeah, they definitely should look at those.
Yeah.
I'm sure is what you meant to say. Yeah. Well, there's a unfortunately, and we talked about this actually with an interview on Friday with one of our science teachers, Mrs. Lung. But there is sort of there is a soullessness that you talked about, the Industrial Revolution and modern life, and so there are certain things that need a little more redemption right now, if that's a fair way to phrase it.
Yeah.
So we do have a request for you to talk a little bit more about the Greek class that you're offering.
Okay. Well, that the Greek course, I don't have the book here handy where I could show it. It's Athanadze, which is actually an Attic Greek course, the Greek of the Athenians. And the reason I chose that is because I really like the book. Number one, it's a 2-volume set. Eventually, I'll offer a Greek 2 course as well. I'm trying not to overextend myself right now with too many courses, but the Greek 1 course will train students in the basics of Attic Greek, and that's actually not a bad thing. People often offer New Testament Greek courses, and I don't knock those at all. Those are very, very important, especially for those that want to go into the ministry. You need to be able to read the Bible and the New Testament in Greek. Must.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, get those New Testament Greek courses if that's what you're aiming for. The one that I'm offering is based on Attic Greek, partly because it will enable you eventually to read the Greek classics in Greek. The book we're using, Athanadze 1, the last chapter ends with reading parts of Aeschylus in Greek, which is really, really cool, really cool. The second volume goes into reading parts of Thucydides and Plato in Greek. At any rate, it does have a side benefit, though, because Koine Greek, which is the Greek the New Testament was written in, is a sort of common man's version. I almost said dumbed down, which is a very bad thing to say. It's a common man's version of Attic Greek. So the Athanadze textbook goes through sequentially, giving you larger and larger chunks of the New Testament as well. So it's like a 2 for the price of 1 course. You're getting Attic Greek, read the classics, and Koine Greek, read the New Testament, all in 1 course.
Nice.
So
wow, you're a born salesman.
Well, I didn't make the book. I just use it. It's a great book. It's a great book.
Well, I think one of the person who asked about the Greek course is a language teacher. I'm a language teacher, and I'm sure we're both thrilled to see. I think one of the most important things you can get when you ask a language teacher about their class is phrases like "it's so cool,"
Yeah.
which definitely popped out of your mouth. Just seeing that enthusiasm and that love for the possibilities and for the things to be studied. I can't resist asking you about Plutarch's Lives, How to Build a Good City. Could you tell us a little bit about that class and the notion of studying cities through biography? Is very interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, okay. So try to keep it on the level of sound bites. The title, How to Build a Good City, is not just like technologically, how do you build a city? How do you lay out the roads? How do you make the zoning and all of that? It actually doesn't have anything to do with that. City there is more of an Aristotelian term where it is the goal that humans are naturally made. We're made speaking beings to interact with each other. We naturally seek out community with each other. This is one way that the Greeks overlap with the Bible, because it's not good for man to be alone. One of the first things God does is make another human, because it's not good for man to be alone, right? And then they spread out and multiply and fill the earth. But anyway, so city is meant to be sort of a metaphor for social life in general. So the course title, now, of course, it's titled How to Build a Good City. Well, one of the things we're going to explore is what is a good city. We don't want to just follow these Greeks wherever they go, because, for instance, one of the first lives we'll read of Plutarch is Lycurgus, and Lycurgus had some pretty nutty ideas, like sharing wives and putting infants out to expose to nature that were not ideal, and a lot of nutty ideas in the Greeks, and we're not going to just hey, this is how you build a good city. But Plutarch's Lives is one of the richest sources I have found for just partly it's biography. It's done. You get into I care about this person, or this is an awful person. I do not like this person at all. You really get into the narrative, and he throws in these little philosophical tidbits here and there. And here's how you find virtue. Here's how you keep the city from falling. It is because Alcibiades did this that the Athenians lost the war. And you start to build up this big picture of what a healthy political order, even just a natural, healthy political order, natural in the sense of non-Christian. One thing Plutarch will do is better help you appreciate what non-Christian political orders look like, the problems that they face, and then you can go, and we Christians have some answers to these things. So it's a double-sided story. How does God use these pagans to build their political orders, which are full of problems? And hey, look, we have the solutions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really fascinating. Right. Well, I think it's really interesting hearing you describe this course, because you have, the courses we've been talking about so far have been integrated humanities courses. And this Plutarch's Lives, How to Build a Good City, is not one of those courses as far as our listing goes. But then the way you talk about it is integrated, right? So you are, you're being a humanities teacher, and approaching anything in this integrated way.
Yeah.
So kudos, I guess.
Well, I wonder that you make me wonder if I should change the description on that. That just, I'll have to talk with them about that. But,
okay.
It really is. I mean, that's what, Plutarch's Lives is like a one-stop shop for politics, ethics, religion, philosophy, law and order. It's just a one-stop shop. So
we'll visit that off stream. In fact, you can stick around now as I say so long to everybody, and we'll talk after.
Okay, cool.
Jonathan Roberts has described your enthusiasm as high energy. I can only agree. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I get excited about these things. You can't shut me up.
Well, we have reached the end of our stream. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. We hope that you find this helpful and enlightening. Mr. Enloe, thank you for stopping in.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.